I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
Modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
We're back for episode 5 of season 2 of Dustbowl Diatribes. And we have with us a special guest, Suan Sonna, who's a former student of mine and has a really interesting background. And so the first thing I wanted to do is just ask Suan to introduce himself and tell us a little bit about your background, how you got to where you are today, where you're doing, among other things, Intellectual Catholicism as a YouTube channel. So just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, well, let me begin by thanking Dr. Lori Johnson and Spencer for having me on the channel. You know, it's funny because I'm no longer your student, Dr. Johnson, but I still want to call you Dr. Johnson because Lori just doesn't feel right to me. So
yeah, get that a lot, but
yeah. So I run a YouTube channel and podcast called Intellectual Catholicism. I was out for a few months discerning with the Dominicans in their novitiate, but I eventually discerned out, and so I came back. And the channel before was called Intellectual Conservatism, and then I moved it to Intellectual Catholicism. I studied philosophy at Kansas State University, and I finished my applications for grad school, and I'm hoping to study New Testament and early Christianity.
Cool. Can I ask you why you changed the name of the channel?
Yeah, so when I came back from the Dominicans, I mean, it was already, like, if you were watching all the content on the channel before I left for the Dominicans, it was very like Catholic apologetics, philosophy, theology oriented. And I realized that my conservatism originally began as kind of this broad kind of Scrutonian, Roger Scruton kind of conservatism. And then as time passed, I started feeling more drawn actually to my Catholic faith and seeing like, oh, Catholicism isn't just like this religion that you put in one corner and then the rest of your life goes on. And, you know, it's like, no, it's a whole worldview. And eventually I saw that, you know, Catholicism became just everything that I really loved and cared about. And so I wanted to kind of have that channel reflect how deeply rooted Catholicism is to the kind of intellectual content that I love and produce.
Well, it was a very, like, I thought, smooth switch. And it sounds like exactly what it is. I think we both appreciate your channel. We think you do a lot of good work. So, like, what is the main aim, would you say, of Intellectual Catholicism? You know, tell people like what it is that you hope that your listeners are getting from it.
Yeah, you know, I view my role as kind of like a curator of just trying to get the best, you know, Catholic intellectual content out there. And so part of the mission is, for example, you know, getting really top-notch thinkers to talk about issues in Catholic theology and philosophy making them accessible. Because I think sometimes people have this idea that professors and philosophers and theologians and friars, they're so distant and far away. But my work is trying to let the people have access to this information. The other thing I'd say too is it aims to have dialogue with people who aren't in the Catholic tradition. So it's not just for Catholics. I mean, I've also had Muslim guests on before, and I'm going to have a series with a Muslim philosopher named Khalil Andani. We're talking about Neoplatonism and the Trinity next. And then after that, we'll be talking about the papacy and Islamic theology. So it's going to be a lot of fun there. And then the last thing I'll say is one thing I want my channel to do is kind of avoid the craziness of the online Catholic apologetics world, because sometimes you have people, I don't know if I should name anybody, but people who kind of basically are sedevacantists or critiquing Pope Francis all the time and railing against Vatican II. And I would like my channel to not go off the rails in that direction, but actually retain, let's say, Catholic orthodoxy.
Real quick, could you define what sedevacantism is?
Yeah, so sedevacantism is the belief that the chair of Peter is empty. So literally, sed vacant, right? So the chair is empty. And, it comes in various forms. Some people will say Pius XII was the last pope. Some people will say there's Benevacantism, which has now become sedevacantism, where people believe that Benedict XVI was the last valid successor of Peter, and then now the chair is empty. So you have all these kinds of crazy positions.
And do you have a read on how, I don't want to go too far down this, but I have a suspicion that there are very few actual Benevacantists. Do you disagree? Like, is this a thing that's really out there beyond, like, I don't know, Patrick Coffin and maybe Taylor Marshall or something like that?
Yeah, I think it's a really small niche phenomenon. Usually, like, if you're a sedevacantist, people typically pick Pius XII as the last one, maybe Pius IX. It depends.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so now that we're on this topic, like, what do you think compels people down that road? Because I've known people like that. I didn't used to have a name for it. But when I even first moved to Kansas, I met people who drew me towards Catholicism. I'm a convert, but I could tell right away there were theories rolling around in their heads that were sort of tangential to the faith. I wasn't quite sure initially how important that was. But as time went by, I realized it, sort of like amounts to kind of conspiracy theory type thinking. And what is your estimation as to what causes people to kind of go down those paths and not remain in orthodoxy, basically?
Yeah, I think you'd have to ask a sedevacantist, and there are all kinds of reasons why they might have that position. But at least from the ones that I know, the reason why they hold to what they believe is because they have a vision based on, let's say, the prior tradition and history of the church of what the papacy is supposed to be, about what the church is supposed to be teaching, about what falls under the magisterium of the Pope. So magisterium means the teaching authority, right? So there's this idea that, well, if the Pope becomes a formal heretic in some way, he has vacated his office, right? Or if he teaches something that they deem heretical, then it's, he's no longer the valid successor of Peter. And so a lot of them, I would say, are very intelligent, but also respectfully very rigid. So they think that, there's not a lot of flexibility for error there. If he makes a mistake, and well, it depends on what capacity it is and all that, that basically the chair has been emptied. And so a lot of sedevacantists rail against Vatican II as a kind of radical rupture in the history of the church with its prior traditions. And so that's usually one place where they'll locate kind of when the chair of Peter ended.
Yeah. In a way, I mean, I sort of think of them as like contemporary Protestants, because there's this point where they say, my understanding of Christianity is different from the church's, and therefore mine is correct and theirs must be wrong. And it seems as simple as that to me. So I've sort of seen it that way. I mean, as soon as I was exposed to this way of thinking, I thought, am I still dealing with a Catholic in a way, because there needs to be a certain level of trust there that the institution will not be guided off course, too far, and that you can trust it. And I wonder if part of what causes this is just like a general distrust in, a fairly well-founded distrust in authorities generally in our modern world that then gets pasted back on to the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would see it as a kind of frustration against like a father figure in a way. It's like you were supposed to be this and you didn't amount to it, And so it's just kind of like this weird sense of not wanting to leave the family. They don't want to actually leave the church and be something else, like a high church Anglican or something like that.
Right.
But they also don't want to be under the current Roman pontiff or, pontiff since Pius the 12th or what have you, or Pius the 9th. So it's a really kind of weird limbo position, if I can put it that way. At least that's how they perceive it, in this kind of like not in the mainstream Catholic, but also not outside. They don't see themselves outside of the church.
Mm-hmm.
They're the faithful remnant still holding on inside of the church. Yeah.
Right, which is basically like a Protestant theory as well, which was used,
Sure.
Against the church during the Reformation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or the Orthodox say,
Yeah.
Well, yeah, welcome to 1054.
Mm-hmm.
But I think where this leads into like a pet issue of Lori and mine's is how part of what we find frustrating about it is, instead of these people working to like Catholicize or Christianize or lead ethical lives, period, they're getting sucked into like an online virtual world where they have all their thought experiments, and the debate is, like how depraved is the Francis papacy or this or that, instead of actually like living out the spiritual and corporal works of mercy, basically. Would you agree with that, or do you have a different take?
That's another difficult issue because, so I know sedevacantists online or even some in person, but there's that question of, I don't know what goes on in their personal or spiritual lives, right? But it does seem like there's this kind of obsession with at least being perceived as uber Orthodox, and kind of a negative identity where it's like, I'm not that, and I want you to know that I'm not that thing, and they'll point to, I don't know, Pope St. John Paul II kissing a Quran or something like that, and then they'll say, that's not what I am, So it's difficult to say, what's going on spiritually, although I will say that their reputation is typically a negative identity, not a positive identity of the spiritual and corporal works of mercy that you talked about. Like when I think about a sedevacantist, you usually don't really think about them doing charity work and all that. Although there are sedevacantist religious orders out there, not valid religious orders, obviously, but you'll have, I think it's like the Sisters of St. Thomas Aquinas or something, where they have their own little convent where they, sing and, produce music and all that, and they live a religious life, but they're not in communion with the current Pope.
Interesting. I didn't know that there were.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh.
There's everything under the sun.
Yeah, I suppose that's inevitable. So kind of along the same lines, there's been an upswing in a sort of Catholic traditionalism that's gaining ground, a sort of, for instance, among those, they're not sedevacantists, but they want to return to a Latin Mass or something close to it. They enjoy the older forms, some attraction to an integralism. So, sort of as I interpreted, maybe you can tell us your take on this, but sort of a return to a close alliance between church and state. At the very least, or maybe even the subsumption of state authority under the church. So, I mean, there's like a spectrum out there, but I have noticed that there's a growing number of people attracted to both traditionalism and integralism. And so I think, we both, Spencer and I, kind of look at that and we think, there are some good things about that. People are trying to, they're getting serious about their faith, and they are trying to discern the best path for themselves and for the church. At the same time, they seem out of step with the current moment. So we were wondering, what your opinion was of those trends.
Yeah. So in terms of traditionalism and integralism, it's important to maybe have a definition, right? So in terms of, let's say, traditionalism, it's really hard to define because one, I think it's obviously a reactionary movement. It's reacting to something that they perceive has gone wrong in the church. And it typically falls at the feet of Vatican II. And the idea, I think, is something like in Vatican II and the post-conciliar church, the church tried too hard to win the approval of the world and to open itself up, right? And then before, what the church was kind of almost, if you will, what they perceive it as, like kind of against the world and saying like the world needs to be called to something higher, something greater, right? And there was more talk, people talk about how even language changed pre-Vatican II versus post-Vatican II. So before, the church used like very objective language. So, it didn't try to, let's say, appeal to your reason necessarily. It tried more to just say, this is the law. This is what we believe. This is the church militant, right? Whereas after after Vatican II, there was this idea of trying to kind of meet people where they are and communicate with them there. And, and the anathemas of the previous ecumenical councils like Trent and so forth still stand, but they are not going to be the focus of how we communicate and try to reason with the world, right? So I think traditionalists, they perceive a lot of these changes as maybe something like embarrassment towards our past tradition, embarrassment towards our identity. And in the process, then this kind of hollowing out of what it means to be Catholic. I think what traditionalists want deep down is for Catholics to be proud that they're Catholics, to not feel ashamed, to have reverence, right? And that's a big thing in traditional circles, reverence towards the Eucharist, towards the Mass, and to follow what the actual books say, right? So, and I'll say too, kind of just giving my perspective on at least traditionalism, there's something that I respect in that because one of the things that I kind of, so recently, one thing that has annoyed me, people talk about, for example, how, let's talk about like the baptism controversy, right? Where you have priests who aren't using the formula properly, and technically the sacrament isn't administered. Now, it might be by a special grace of God, as the Catechism says, that, God's not bound by the sacraments, but we are, that he could have still given salvific grace and sanctifying grace, into the person, even if the sacrament wasn't validly administered. And so when the person dies, it's not going to be like God says, whoops, well, the priest didn't say the right words. So even though you've lived your whole life following me, that's not how it's going to happen. But still, like, you want things to be done as they're supposed to be done. You want the words, the law of the church, the beliefs to actually mean something, right? And so, for me recently, like I've gone on to confession recently on 2 occasions, and both times the priest didn't give the absolution formula properly. They shortened it. And technically speaking, that's not a valid confession then. The sacrament wasn't administered, so I had to go to another church to get it done properly. The second time I went to a Latin Mass church to get it done properly, So all that's to say is that I think traditionalism is a reaction to what people perceive as a kind of shame and hollowing out of Catholicism. And then when it comes to integralism, right, the typical definition of integralism is something like the temporal sword is subject to the spiritual sword. The sword of Peter kind of trumps or is above, sets the standard, the measure for the secular powers. And in this regard, I think it goes back to a reaction in the political sphere to the failures of liberalism, to the failures that we could have, let's say, a government that's morally neutral and, meet the interests of both religious and non-religious people. I think a lot of religious people, especially devout Catholics who have felt the power of the state come down on them, coerce them against their beliefs or attempt to, there's this kind of anger and frustration that they are being pushed out and ignored. And so their reaction is, well, then wouldn't it be better if the state were under the power of the church?
Mhm. And again, have you run into a lot of integralists online, or is it like DC Schindler in his Politics of the Real book refers to it as like a thought experiment, that it's mostly just online and people saying, wouldn't it be nice if we had like a dictatorship of the papacy? Or do you think this is a live actual movement, at least within segments of the church?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I will say that I have a lot of integralist friends online. So, and I'm even friends online with like some of the kind of top integralist proponents. So people like, for example, the Dominican friar, Father Thomas Crean, I'm friends with him on Facebook. I've had him on my channel before to talk about integralism. Alan Fimister, I'm friends with him on Facebook. Let's see who else there is. And then other friends who run their own YouTube channels and podcasts, they'll talk about how they support integralism. But, you know, it does seem to right now be kind of in the thought experiment realm, where people are just saying on a philosophical level, you know, wouldn't it be nice? And here are the merits of the integralist arguments. And then you have obviously people who vocally oppose it. So I don't know how organized I'd say the actual kind of integralist movement is, but it is something that I've seen online quite often among especially young Catholic men.
Yeah, I think you're right that at the very least, it represents a frustration with the whole state of affairs, you know, and the lack of kind of authority in the world. And so, you know, people ideally, and I mean, I think at least I could say, like, if everything like worked ideally, if the church as an institution ideally acted right, and if people as Christians ideally did so too, right, then having that kind of close integration of church and state would actually be beneficial. And then the problem is that neither human institution quite rises to that level of perfection or ideal. And then, you know, the thought becomes scary, or you say, you know, like impossible, like it remains in the realm of thought because it is so like far from the reality of the matter. Our society is just so, you know, partly due going all the way back to the Protestant Reformation and going forward through liberalism is so not amenable to true authority, is not, you know, doesn't recognize it at all, right? And equates like freedom with not doing so. And in that kind of environment, even the church is affected by, you know, the same attitude, at least in its actual, you know, parts. And so in that type of environment, I don't even think it would, if it could possibly happen, which it can't, it would not work well, because it would only work if everybody was doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing, if that makes sense. I don't know.
Actually, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that's the difficulty with kind of all of our political musings, right? And even in ethics, there's the people who advocate ideal theory versus non-ideal theory. You know, so some people will say that you can't really universalize and always have an absolute moral principle because, you know, it might be on a case-by-case basis, right? So maybe you're a situationalist in that way. So I think deep down, though, what you were expressing, Dr. Johnson, was the fact that I think all Catholics are united, or should be at least, all Orthodox Catholics are united in the belief of wanting the kingship of Christ. We ultimately want that day to come when Christ is on the throne ruling the earth. And we don't have to, well, one is that the church and the state would be one and the same in the person of Christ, you know, the priest and the king. And it would be managed by the perfect God-man, right? And then and then under the administration of the angels and saints, you know, and so that would be what we want to aim towards, or rather, well, that's controversial. We would want that reality to come about one day, right? Now, I think what everybody's concerned about though is to what extent should we strive to bring heaven to earth, or to what extent should we allow heaven to come on its own time?
And where do you stand on that question?
That's such a tough one. So I would say that I think, so what I'll do is kind of on my view, right? I think that it's really impossible to run a state without committing to a basic theory of ethics. And so to kind of talk about maybe John Rawls for a little bit, John Rawls talked about how in our kind of liberal society, our politically liberal society, there's this idea of public secular reason, where there are certain kinds of arguments that work in compelling the public, right? And so if I was to use something like a religious argument from the book of Deuteronomy or Exodus or Leviticus to try and make policy, that wouldn't obviously fly in our politically liberal society. Whereas it might work in, let's say, a theological circle, right? My idea would be, we can't begin from neutrality. We can't pretend neutrality. We have to already, if we're going to build a society, have a constitution, have law, have a way of reasoning about law and ethics, we have to be clear on some theory. And so I would say that we would have to begin as Aristotelian Thomists under the natural law paradigm, under the classical natural law paradigm. So some people say, well, then that automatically means this and that. And it's like, well, no, not necessarily, right? It just means that you have to reason within that framework. Now, that framework will prohibit and make it more difficult to assert certain things, right? So to give an example, it would make, if you take that classical natural law stance, it would make, for example, kind of unlimited, unhinged capitalism restricted, right? Because it would take into account the rights of the poor to have their natural right to have the excess of whatever wealth there is in a society, right? I mean, Aquinas talks about this. A bunch of the church fathers within the natural law framework talk about this, right? So it would make certain things more difficult to argue for, like if you wanted just an unregulated free market, right? So you begin with that theory of ethics. And then when we get to the issue of church and state, my position is that the church and state should be in cooperation with each other. And we also shouldn't beat around the bush, and I mean, by that, I mean, look, the state's going to take on this kind of natural law perspective that is compatible with the social teaching of the church. But in terms of, let's say, enforcing dogma and doctrines, that's the job of the church to do. The state shouldn't have any role in that. The church should be the social kind of, let's say, handmaiden of the church in that way. It should be supporting, the policies of the church in terms of, let's say, if the church is going to talk about the poor, if the church is going to talk about how usury is immoral, then the state within its framework has an obligation, if you will, to not violate that social teaching or principle, right? So, I mean, I do believe in the cooperation of church and state, that there shouldn't just be this awkwardness between both institutions. But it has to be based on, we were talking before about kind of the lecture of, was it Andrew Willard Jones, and kind of his work in this area. And he talked about how, before in like medieval society, there was this idea of the relationship between everybody of counsel and aid. And I think something like that on the level of the church and state would be beneficial if the church and the state, saw themselves as providing counsel and aid to each other and somehow working together towards the good of the whole, right? But now the thing that I don't want to happen is the state to, let's say, make Catholicism the religion of the land, right? And force, because I mean, then you get into the issues of what are the rights of religious minorities in that society? And then typically when integralism has been tried, it, I think naturally, intrinsically leads to the suppression of rights of, especially the Jewish people. And so I don't want that to happen in our society, right? So there has to be a gentle relationship between the church and state, but a gentle kind of cooperation. And I should just add very quickly that gentle cooperation happens through at least the state endorsing the same basic moral theory as the church, which is natural law theory.
And then, so riffing off that, how would, just hypothetically, how do you think that could ever be brought about, barring basically like revival, mass conversion? That would be, because this is where when I listen to like Catholic political theorists, they leave it unsaid. So I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, so that's such a huge challenge, because you got to ask, where is this going to happen, right? If we're talking about the United States, then we have to deal with then the legacy of kind of the classical. Well, actually, I wouldn't even say it's classical natural law, of the classical liberal tradition within our society and the ramifications that has, right? So if we were actually going to practically bring about, let's say, this vision of society, we would need some type of mass conversion, right? And we would also need, well, I think the first way that you begin the conversion or the revival is if you can show that an Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysics is plausible. And that's what a lot of people have been doing. So, for example, the philosopher Rab Koons down in UT Austin, I think Alexander Pruss and other Thomistic philosophers have been looking at quantum theory, saying Aristotle has been vindicated, and then they're trying to lead to this revival of Aristotelian Thomism. And I think if you can do that, and eventually what happens is, as there are, let's say, Catholics and other Christians and theists in our society who are tired of, let's say, either moral relativism, or they're tired of a kind of maybe even robust, progressive, secular moral theory. Maybe it's a kind of utilitarian framework. Maybe, it's some other form of consequentialism. As the movement kind of goes towards, okay, we need to have a response to progressive secular ideology, and that response is best maintained within an Aristotelian Thomist tradition, then you could actually, within, at least among the academics and then the everyday people, have a kind of, let's say, in their minds, a default of like, no, Aristotelian Thomism is the correct worldview. Law needs to be understood through this moral framework. Then that could become possible. And Robert George, who's a McCormick professor of jurisprudence at Princeton, he's tried to argue that a kind of perfectionism within his natural law framework is compatible with the classical liberal tradition in the United States. Now, there are going to be challenges to that thesis. In his book, Making Men Moral, that's what he attempts to argue. And if that thesis is successful, then you could potentially have Aristotelian Thomists among academics and everyday people. Let's say eventually they get into law and they can simultaneously balance, let's say, constitutional jurisprudence with natural law jurisprudence somehow within Robert George's vision.
See, I dislike the tendency to try to mash up these two very different ways of thinking. I think I agree with D.C. Schindler from The Politics of the Real that the two are antithetical, that liberalism is a rejection of Christianity, pure and simple, and especially in the institution of the Catholic Church. And so they can't be made to go together. I know there's a whole like academic industry trying to make this happen because we want to preserve our way of life. We want to think of our founding as good and so on. I don't buy it. And I guess I wanted to back up and just because I think your points are well taken about the Aristotelian framework, about natural law, just to make sure that our listeners understand what you're talking about when you talk about the Aristotelian Thomistic framework and natural law. Could you say a little bit more about that contribution? Because a lot of people, especially like Protestants for sure, wouldn't know what we're talking about right now. Like, why is that important? What is it?
So, there's a lot that goes into Aristotelian Thomism, right? But the basic idea is that it is the science of human fulfillment. So what it looks at is what fulfills the human person. What are the conditions for fulfillment? What are the goods that we as human beings from our nature naturally pursue and require? And so it begins with a very robust anthropology. Anthropology just means, our study of human nature, how we act, what motivates us, what moves us, how we operate. Um, and within that, then it says that we can observe the patterns of human nature and behavior and discern its nature, and then actually answer the question, like, what leads to its fulfillment, or humans' fulfillment and happiness. That's the very simple way of putting it. And then the reason why it's Aristotelian is because it's built within that framework of Aristotle. And then it's Thomist insofar as what Thomas had done was expanded upon Aristotle's kind of moral theory and political theory and brought it within a Christian framework. And I'll just say up front too, that even for like Protestant listeners, one might think that, oh, well, it's Aristotelian Thomist and Thomas was a Catholic, so you can't have Protestants who are Aristotelian Thomists. And that's not true. There are many Protestant philosophers who are also Thomists. So it's not necessarily Catholic.
But it tends to be associated. Could you give like one concrete example of how this more expansive anthropology and what fulfillment would look like on any specific issue, and maybe how that contrasts with a liberal anthropology?
Yeah. So to give an example, natural law theorists, when they talk about, what they do is first they begin with what are the goods that are necessary for human flourishing, right? And so typically they'll list 7. So things like life, knowledge, friendship, work, and leisure. Other things on the list are included as well. Religion, aesthetics is another one of them too. So, for example, when you look at the let's say Universal Declaration on Human Rights, one of the things that it talks about is the right to leisure, so that people shouldn't be living in a society where they have to work constantly all the time, receive barely any adequate pay. And so that kind of is cyclical, right? Because if you don't receive adequate pay, then you need to keep working to the point where you don't have time for friendship. You don't have time for leisure. And work no longer becomes a fulfilling exercise of your powers and faculties, but instead becomes a burden, right? So the natural law theorists would actually be willing to justify, if it's necessary, state intervention to, let's say, secure a just wage so that leisure and friendship and the other goods of the human person can be pursued. Whereas under a liberal framework, the idea is that if you think fundamentally human beings are kind of the product of a contract, a rational contract, right? Then the idea is that, well, you sign your name on the dotted line to work this many number of hours so long as your employer needs it to be done. And if somehow, let's say, through the invisible hand of the market, it has been determined that the most that can be rationally given to you is $5 an hour, and you need to work 100 hours a week or something like that, something crazy, right? Then that needs to happen because it's just simply part of the rational contract. What a natural law theorist is going to say is, human beings are obviously rational. We have contractual obligations, but the fundamental kind of, let's say, thing that we're all pursuing is the good. And so if the contract, for example, would limit your capacity to pursue the good or be detrimental to the human good, to the common good even, then it needs to be modified.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we have to actually think about what will be conducive to our happiness and well-being prior to making our other decisions. This seems to be the most impossible thing for people to do. I think liberalism is like such a powerful system because it avoids that question. It avoids the question of what is the good life? How ought we to live? And this is where the Aristotelian Thomistic way of thinking does, it's a corrective. And it has its own baggage. You've kind of alluded to it, that there are certain conclusions from this framework that people don't like, and therefore because of that, because some of those things, like for instance, maybe having to do with reproductive rights or something like that, are not popular, the whole way of thinking then gets tossed out, right, in favor in favor of the other. But that is a loss, right? Because the problem with liberalism, it's empty. It has no ability. There is no ability to like give people guidance or define what the good life is.
Mhm.
So we're missing that, and I don't know how we ever, given all the landmines that I've just alluded to, like
Mhm.
how we get people to be open again to that way of thinking. But I think that you described it very well.
Mm.
And I didn't realize that there were also Protestant
Yeah.
Aristotelian Thomists out there.
The most famous one is Norman Geisler. He was an Aristotelian Thomist. There might be some others, but I know that he's like the most famous one. Although he's passed away not too long, or I think he's passed. He's gone. Mm.
Okay.
Mhm.
Well, so I mean that kind of, I don't know. Well, Spencer, did you have a question that you wanted to ask?
Yeah, let me just ask one question just to like
Sure.
tie this discussion up with a bow.
Yeah.
Let me try and rephrase what I took you to be saying to make sure we understood you and see if you have any further thoughts. To realize, maybe it would be fair to say you're like a semi-integralist, that you believe there should be this back and forth between church and state, the two swords, but you don't want to get too totalitarian. We don't want to be repressing the Jews, etc. And let's say if America gets there in 100 years or something, it would be because there is on the part of intellectuals like a widespread conversion to Aristo-Thomism, and then there's to use some Marxist terms, there'd be like a primitive accumulation of cadre. You'd get all of these philosopher activists, and they'd have a long march through the institutions, and they'd change or modify America's juridical framework. They'd manage to do this like neoconservative fusion of Aristo-Thomism with America's liberal framework. And then on that basis, maybe we could have your semi-integralist state.
Yeah. One thing I want to say up front too is, when I was talking about traditionalism and integralism, one thing I wanted to acknowledge was that I think there's some truth in what these frameworks are saying, or these movements are saying. Just as, for example, in Roger Scruton's book, How to Be a Conservative, he actually goes through socialism, communism, these other frameworks to talk about what he sees as though good and true in them, even if he disagrees with them ultimately, right? And so, as you alluded to, me being a semi-integralist, right? There are things that I think are actually good about integralism, and that it doesn't beat around the bush about what is to be the ethic of society, what is to be the currency within, let's say, our public reason, within our social space, and also not beating around the bush about the cooperation of church and state. The thing about integralism that I don't like, though, is that one explicit part of it is the subordination of the state to the church. And for me, one that I remember first hearing like the definition of integralism and how it wants the spirit, this temporal sword, to be subordinate to the spiritual. And I'm like, okay, well, that doesn't seem like the right kind of way of looking at things, because grace perfects nature, right? In Christ, he's fully God and fully man. There wasn't a kind of, let's say, subordination there, at least, in terms of the completeness of the incarnate word as being fully man and fully God, right? And so, and even the idea really of the resurrection of human bodies and nature being ultimately lifted up to God and to meet him face to face. I think so that's why the idea of this kind of subordinate relationship isn't favorable to me, but why I also like the idea of a gentle cooperation where the church and the state can speak the same language because they have the same moral framework. Now, you also described the movement, right, to kind of convert, if we're talking about the American context, the juridical framework into a kind of as you put it, Aristo-Thomism, right? I mean, that's the best shot that I think we have. But I think Dr. Johnson is onto something when she says that, these frameworks are kind of antithetical to each other, right? I think what would have to happen is we would have to, the hybrid that would be created, if insofar as the hybrid can be created, we would have to also be acknowledging that it is also a critique of the founding as well, the final product that we have. And we also can't pretend that our current, well, that's another topic, but we already in so many ways we've departed from the founding and the vision that was there in all kinds of places, right? So America is kind of constantly recreating its own identity, and then only after the fact thinks about its continuity with the founding. So that's just something, those are just some of my comments there.
Mhm.
So like before I get on to the next question that I was thinking of prior to this, for me, like the big sort of elephant in the room here
Mhm.
is democracy itself, in the sense that, obviously, truly, I believe the biggest obstacle to a more intelligent sort of cooperation between an intelligent church and state is that the majority of people do not want that, don't understand it, and then there's a significant group of people within that majority that are literally almost at the point of total disorder, as in not understanding what democratic participation means, thinking about the use of force, becoming simply disruptive, not being able to, act in a concerted, coordinated way, lashing out. We have a growing political problem where people have, gotten very frustrated and angry, but they don't have the intellectual or organizational tools to do anything about that other than be exceedingly disruptive, cruel, rude, etc. And I'm not just talking about right wing, but also across the spectrum. Okay, it's just incivility is a term used so frequently that it doesn't quite even capture what I'm talking about. But throughout my entire career, I've asked myself the question, and I've never completely been comfortable answering it. But can democracy really function well? Can you get a system in which there is an intelligent cooperation such as you're describing,
Mhm.
For the good, that can define what the good is, that can act in a way that actually restrains the market when necessary and does what's necessary, for the environment and for just human well-being, prioritizes things correctly, what is truly important for human flourishing. No, it's not a Happy Meal, and stuff like that. And, I'm just going to ask, what your view of democracy is. Do you kind of see its problematic nature in the same way, or do you find some hope in it still, or what?
Yeah, these are you're all asking the good questions. The questions that'll get me crucified, right? I think that I think democracy. I think let's just say what everybody knows, which is that democracy is flawed, and critically so. So for example, as you pointed out, the reason why democracy is so popular is because it has the best claim to legitimacy, insofar as people feel like they're involved, they're included, they get their voice in, they have some type of actually institutionally built-in power, right? So that's why democracies are really popular. But then the other problems that you mentioned, like the actual administration of the state, or or needing to have that coordinated vision. In a democracy, it's so disordered and so all over the place that you can't really get a united vision of what it means to, let's say, have an identity, to have a common ethic, right? It tends to fray into all kinds of different factions and so on and so forth. And democracy there is extremely flawed, which is why I think what people, or at least what tends to make people happier, and you see this already within our own society, is that you'll have people subscribe to a thinker to do the thinking for them. So think about like people who, they watch Ben Shapiro, or they listen to all these other kind of media outlets and thinkers and philosophers, right? Like people who really are huge fans of Noam Chomsky and all that. They have those philosophers sometimes do the thinking for them, to be their voice, to be their representative, right? And it doesn't mean that they lose their own voice or representation, but they have someone there to do it for them. And so already then we get from this getting away from direct democracy into indirect democracy, but then people want their thinkers to be really good, and they want someone who can really manage and give their time and expertise to deal with economic and social problems that they don't have the time to study themselves. So then you get into technocracy, right? Rule by the experts. And so actually the form of government that I'm most comfortable with is something like a technocracy, where you have the experts running the show. Although that gets really complicated too, because there are flaws in that system as well. But bottom line is, when people say that democracy is the best compromise, I'm like, well, it depends on what you think the good trade-off is, right? So for example, some people think legitimacy is so important that the everyday person feels heard, right? That you can trade off everything else just for that good. Whereas I'm like, wait, no. The other things that we're trading off, like just a stable government or a common ethic, those are also really important. And so, that's what I'll say there. I do agree with you, though, that democracy is very flawed. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that we don't have room for people to express themselves, but just, I guess, the vision of democracy that everybody can be their own kind of self-governing authority and power, this kind of atomistic understanding, right, of the person, that's where I think things get wrong. But ideally, you would want a government that has some way of including other people and the common person's voice somehow, some way.
Or put another way, to better integrate people's genuine voices and their actual interests.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Which to me seems like, if anything like integralism were ever realized, it wouldn't just be this interplay between church and state. It would be like also between like the state and the family and the people, and like all the intermediaries between the state and the family or the individual, that there would be this whole dance between nature and grace at every level. That seems to me to be what they're calling for in the best instance.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree.
So what did you think about I'm blanking on his Andrew Willard Jones lecture that Lori sent over to you?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, there's just so many things about that lecture that were beautiful, like how he moved from I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but the analogy that he had woven with the four senses of Scripture, the literal, and then the allegorical, the tropological, and the anagogical, right? So I should probably break down those terms, right? The literal or historical sense is just simply what was historically intended by the letters that you see in the text of Scripture, right? So for example, when the law of Moses says that, pork is prohibited, it literally meant, don't eat anything from a pig, right? And then you have the allegorical interpretation, which tries to see how the things fit within the story of salvation history. So it kind of looks at the text, grabs the thing itself, kind of abstracting out, and then connects them together. So to give an example, the Davidic kingship, when you look at it closely, it reflects the kingship of Christ that is to come, right? So you see that typological kind of relationship between the things themselves. The anagogical deals with the moral kind of lesson that you get from the text. And then the tropological deals with the kind of mystical, eschatological interpretation. So I won't get into that. But the basic point that Willard Jones made in his presentation, that let's see here, that in the medieval vision, you had the Davidic kingship, and so the literal historical sense, and then the kingship of Christ together in one. And this, how all that was connected into the vision of the world, where literally the Trinity, the metaphysics of the Trinity, and the peace between the persons of the Holy Trinity, how that was the framework for understanding peace and order in society, or how even heresy was not just conceived of as violating a religious doctrine, but actually a form of violence, right? That, all of that was incredible. Now, let me get down to kind of the more meaty stuff, though. So aside from my praises for the presentation, it was really the end of his lecture that troubled me in a good way, right? So he talked about how the medievals would see our politics, with its emphasis on sovereignty and power and just kind of rights at the forefront, rather than rights as kind of, let's say, the organic outgrowth of this counsel and aid relationship. You bring in rights when you need to, when things are violated, and then once you have reparations and you're all back together as friends and family again, talk of rights kind of goes out the window, because there's this kind of silent implied understanding, right? So the way that he described our politics as a politics of despair, that hits it right on the head. And then when he talks about how if we have this politics of despair where we can't even have heaven on earth, even imperfectly, or we don't even strive to have heaven on earth, then what happens in society is heaven is dispensed with and is kicked into another realm. And that's something to think about, because at least in conservative political thought, or even in classical liberal thought, the two are somewhat connected given the history of Western civilization. Conservatism and classical liberalism, one of the fundamental doctrines that they have is what's known as the tragic vision. And so the tragic vision is this idea, kind of best articulated by the economist Thomas Sowell, that humans are intrinsically limited. And when you push human beings beyond their actual limits, rather than working within those limits, when you try to perfect human nature and you treat it as something that is malleable by the state, by other institutions, then you get into a state of affairs that is ultimately worse off for human beings. So, for example, like the most famous defense or way that this has been applied is with capitalism, because the idea is that human beings are inherently selfish. And rather than trying to do away with that selfishness, let's use that selfishness, that self-interest, for the good of the common person, the common good, right? That's one way in which the tragic vision is used to justify capitalism. It's just necessary, built in. So I'm in a conundrum because I accept the tragic vision, where at least there's a real human nature, and you have to work within the confines of that real human nature. And sin, now bringing in my religious worldview, which is part of my political worldview, sin, even if it's not intrinsic to human beings, right? Because it is a parasite. In the Garden of Eden, we were created good. And the fundamental identity of the human person is that being which is created in the image of God. So we were created good. But sin is a reliable parasite. Even for the person who is under the dominion of original sin, but even for the person who has been baptized, has received sanctifying grace, we are still having to deal with that parasite that first corrupted our human parents. And so, to kind of cut the long story short, he left some really troubling questions for me to confront, which is, does my own worldview lead to kind of dispensing with heaven in the political realm?
As in, is there a tendency to more or less say salvation and like complete unity with God's will can only happen in the next life, and therefore we can't really like even come close to that, sort of like the city of man and the city of God. This is the city of man. And so what I hear you saying is that the talk kind of like made you question the extent to which that division, not that the division doesn't exist, because I think we all probably agree it does, right? But
including Willard Jones.
yeah,
Mhm.
right. But that there's perhaps, or ought to be, more hope for more of the kingdom of God in this world.
Yeah, I mean, basically, so right when I talked about like dispensing with heaven, what I mean is this idea that we eventually turn heaven into this totally different realm, this
Mhm.
kind of far off idea, this really nice reality that has no bearing on this world today, right?
Right.
And I mean, which is the problem with why I think so many religious people, you know, when we look at Charles Taylor's work on secularism, they kind of feel like this, they're doing this weird kind of, they're divided, right? Where it's like we're in public, we're kind of fitting within secularism, we're doing the things that we're supposed to be doing, using the public reason. But then in our churches, we're kind of finally safe to kind of take off our mask, right, and be who we really want to be, right? My worry is that given the fact that I do want to be a realist, and I think everybody wants to be a realist to some extent, and but have the ideals, right? But practically, when we apply our realism, do we still just then get secularism again, ultimately, and the sharp division between heaven and earth? Because, you know, so, you know, because for example, as someone who wants to be a realist, who tries to strive for that, I'll often sound like a pessimist to my idealistic friends, right? Um, and some of my idealistic friends. So, for example, let me give you a really concrete illustration. So, take nuclear denuclearization, right? Um, I'm in the camp that doesn't believe that we should do away with all of our nuclear warheads, because then people are going to, obviously, when the question arises, well, what do you do when somebody doesn't comply with the agreement and has a nuke, right? Then they have power over everybody else, right? And what do we do then? Just hope to appeal to their humanity at that point. Whereas other people are going to say, no, you're immoral. You have such a dark view of human nature, Swan. We should go for denuclearization because that's the right thing to do. We're striving to bring the kingdom of God on the earth, right? And so then I'm kind of in this weird place where it's like, do we have to be realists, but then end up, you know, with secularism again, or do we have to be idealists, but then end up with this kind of, I don't want to say. Let me try to think of a charitable way to put it, but a kind of, I would imagine it as basically Sisyphus, you know, carrying that stone up to the top and then watching it fall and then carrying it again, where you know it's not going to work. Rationally, you know that there's no way you're going to get heaven on earth before Christ returns, but you keep on trying for it anyway. And then you're just waiting for that day when, after you've exhausted so much of your life and energy, Christ comes and says, let me carry the stone. So it's a
Yeah.
kind of absurdity on both ends.
Perhaps appreciating that you tried, you know, like,
Right. Yeah.
I totally get, totally agree with the concern that if we try to bring heaven to earth through our political systems, that we are likely to get a worse situation, right? Some form of totalitarianism. I think that's been made abundantly clear by history. But I think that we do tend to think of one or the other. It's all this or it's all that. And if Christ is king, he's not just king in this other mythical realm, but everywhere and at all times. And if that's so, then maybe it's not so much a question of do you strive to bring heaven to earth, but do you strive to obey, you know, his commands? Do you strive to do what he wants? Because he obviously wanted people in this life to behave in a certain way. And I think if we all did that, we would have a substantially better like situation than we currently have, even though it would still be very imperfect, you know, because human beings are imperfect, but it would be so much better. And I struggle with, yeah, like with the binary there, that it's either this or that, because I don't think that we have to think of it that way, right? And doing so gives us an excuse not to basically be obedient, both to Christ and to the church, as it asks us to actually do things in the world. So, I mean, does that offer any comfort, right? Like that you can be a certain type of realist. I mean, I totally understand your struggle. I haven't actually thought about that question maybe as much as I should. Of course, who doesn't hate nuclear weapons? I probably, if I thought about it, would agree with you that in a practical sense, it's pretty darn, it might be even seen as downright irresponsible to completely denuclearize in the world that we currently live in without careful prolonged like strategy and negotiations and so on. So, I feel like I have a lot of realist in me, but I don't see it competing with the basic striving to actually be obedient, to actually like try to live the life that Jesus kind of modeled and also spoke about. Do they have to be at all like in contradiction with each other?
Right. So I don't want them to be in conflict with each other, right? For when you talked about the idea that Jesus is not just the king of some mythical realm, or we enter into fairyland when we open our Bibles, and then when we come back, when we shut our books, and then we go back to the real world, then all the magic ends. No, I don't want to have that vision of the world, right? And what you described is basically what integralists would call their doctrine of the social kingship of Christ. Where it's this idea that, as in Matthew chapter 28, Jesus receives all authority on heaven and on earth. So Jesus really is the king of the earth. And our goal is to then bring all governments into conformity with the vision of Christ, so that he really is the king. That's our part that we play. The other thing too is, talking about the church, the church, when we talk about like trying to bring heaven down to earth, I think oftentimes, there are all kinds of theological problems with that kind of language. Like one is that it's not our place to really bring heaven to earth, right? Because that's kind of God's divine prerogative. Now we can be ministers and instruments of that cause, right? But the church has talked about how literally in the catechism and elsewhere, how the church is a pilgrim, how in some sense we are foreigners in this world, no matter how much we try. And, we live under Caesar, we try to cooperate with the state, but then ultimately we know that deep down, this isn't quite where we belong just yet, And so, that might be something there with the tension between kind of, on the one hand, the idealist, on the other hand, the realist, on this question of what's the relationship between heaven, the kingdom of God, and the earth. Maybe it's good that tension remains. And what we try, and the way that we bridge the tension, bridge the binary, is we say we're trying our best to obey the vision of Christ and the vision that of God as the creator of the natural law, and so on and so forth, right? Which is why I think at least my gentle cooperation model is an attempt to try to bridge that tension, but also maintain it.
Yeah. And so one of the things that's been really striking to me as I've converted to Catholicism the last year is how utterly, not even, well, maybe ignorant, but like Catholic social teaching in terms of the Catholics I've encountered isn't even on the table. Their Catholicism has so thoroughly been liquidated just into American conservatism that it just means being pro-life. And I was just, it seems to me that part of what the social teaching is trying to get us to do is thread the needle between, yes, we can't make everything perfect, we can't just bring heaven down to earth, but we can also do some things. So last night I've been going through Pius XI's Quadragesimo Anno or something like that, and the subtitle is on the reconstruction of the social order. And what's frustrating to me is like, why isn't that on the table for so many Catholics? Or am I wrong? Is it on the table?
Yeah, well, particularly in the American conservative context, right? We have to think about, I think for some Catholics, there's the desire to belong within the nation as well. And so if we start talking about Catholic social doctrine that sounds communist and socialist, then we make ourselves aliens again. And we work so hard and so long in the history of America to fit in, right, that we don't want to lose our seat at the table anymore and be delegitimated. We've come a long way from the days of John F. Kennedy, where the U.S. was suspicious of having a Catholic president, to now we're under another Catholic president again. And then even this Catholic president is trying to balance the values of the Democratic Party and his belief that he is a devout Catholic, right? Even, what was it, Tim Kaine under Hillary Clinton, whenever he was asked about his positions on abortion, you could visibly see how uncomfortable he became, because he was, I think deep down, he is pro-life and he wants to be pro-life, but he also is committed to the Democratic Party. And so he has to have that internal conflict. So I think regardless of if you're left or right, there's this kind of internal conflict and dance between wanting to fit in and wanting to be Catholic. And what often happens is people will decide to try and do both somehow, but then ultimately it comes at the price of one or the other.
So, I mean, isn't that, I'm going to just be blunt here, isn't that idolatry? When one decides that one would rather fit in and sort of conform than follow Catholic teachings, they're to pick and choose, to prefer social acceptance and political acceptance to what the church teaches.
Yeah, no, it is idolatry. And quite literally, when Jesus in the Gospels talks about how you have to place him before even your friends and your family, right? He's pointing out that as human beings, we want to have this kind of social acceptance. And so what we'll try to do is we'll try to get both. And Jesus is saying, no, you have to place me first and be willing to lose everything for my sake, because I will reward you. And part of faith is then trusting that if I do lose my social acceptance in place and how long I've worked to build this reputation, that it will ultimately be given back to me in Christ's kingdom.
Right. There's this image in like Walter Brueggemann's, he's a Protestant theologian, and he's got this image of basically the Christian as an exile, or the Christian is sort of a sojourner, a stranger in a strange land. They can't be like fully in league with any empire or any form of government. But if they do, then they're worshiping that government. They're worshiping empire rather than Christ, rather than God. And that's always stuck with me. When people have to choose between Christ and their social group, right? Or their social acceptability, there's only one good choice and there's one bad choice. And I mean, one of the things that we've talked about with other people on this channel is just like, what is the responsibility that pastors, we've talked to Protestants so far, but we're moving into no, we haven't. We're across the spectrum at this point. The question is, do they have like an obligation to remind people of the full, Christian responsibility, that you have to resist questions about your popularity, your social acceptability, whether you fit in, what team you're on, and so on and so forth, and that you really do need to listen, not cherry pick when it comes to Catholic teaching, if you're a Catholic. I know that you're not aiming at the priesthood, but you did think about it. And so like in thinking about like the role of the priest, how do you see that? Like, is American priesthood like a lot of other, I would say a lot of other Christian leadership tends to kind of often dance around that. They will talk a lot about the pro-life position, but they won't talk about other aspects of Catholic social teaching that are just as, if we ignore them, are just as deadly to people. Just thoughts on that, like what the state of affairs is from your perspective.
Yeah, so from my interaction, I was discerning with the Dominicans for a few months, and I was seeing kind of firsthand some of the nitty gritty behind parish administration. And even before then, I was sitting down talking to priests from other kind of religious institutes, and they'll talk about how, they'll have people who will call the bishop and complain about something they say in their homily. And then next thing you know, the bishop is cracking down on them or asking them about what happened, and then you have this weird environment where you're trying to shepherd this parish, but then the sheep are biting at you, and then you don't really know which sheep bit you. And then it just sets everything into an awkward dynamic, right? And so you want to, as a priest, have this this weird balancing act between, remaining in good relationship with your flock, but also guiding them forward and instructing them. And sometimes what the flock will do is feel entitled enough to kind of use a hammer on the shepherd. And then that kind of gets all things, messed up. The other thing I'll say too is just with respect to the flock, with the laity, with everyday people, because we're so politically sensitive and charged. For example, like the pro-life cause, in a Catholic church, of course, that's going to have the choir singing, right? Everyone's going to be happy to hear about that, or should be. But then let's say things like having a just wage, a living wage, things like the excess of your wealth belongs to the poor, or the universal destination of goods, right? These types of things. If you bring them up, what's going to happen is it's going to hit the laity and their ears and the political sensitivities that we have as Americans in our current environment, and it's just going to make everything go haywire, right? And then in that homily, you might not have the time to get into all the nuances and so on and so forth. So then it becomes dynamite, right? So and this is the problem though, because then it becomes really easy to just kind of focus on the vague moral teaching of the gospel, which then becomes something like be nice. But then we kind of treat, let's say, Jesus's work on the cross and the resurrection and the establishment of the church as the gospel. And then all your other social justice stuff is all over here. Maybe there are consequences of the gospel, but they're not also just as intimately tied into the gospel itself. And I think that's a major problem, right? When you treat the gospel, when you treat the main message of Christianity as somehow not in itself containing social justice, but maybe logically implying it. But then we have to kind of work on the details privately together on how that all works out. I think that the fundamental kind of the thing that unites Christ's salvific work on the cross and the resurrection with his moral and social teaching is this idea that the kingdom of God is among us, that the kingdom of God is already here and will one day be consummated, right? So Jesus really did see the world as under a different administration now. And it was through the cross and through the resurrection that he became king.
Mm-hmm. So what could be done to avoid this dynamic? Because I think you described the dynamic really well, which is, like I also would self-edit if I thought that the bishop, or in my case, the dean, was going to be all over me, because I said something. It's only human. You would like to think that the bishop would not be like taking his first cues from the parishioners, but rather from like actually knowing what was going on in the what was being taught. And that's another thing, I guess. Like when I converted to the Catholic Church, I assumed it would be superior in the sense that what was said at the top would filter its way down, and that this is what you would get from top to bottom, because it does kind of come across as a hierarchical institution, right? Mm-hmm. And there's some benefits to that, right? But that doesn't seem to be the way it functions in this country, right? So you get that kind of phenomenon where one person can upend the priest by, calling the bishop, who doesn't necessarily know what the priest is saying, but he should, in this kind of thing. So, maybe, this is what Larry Chapp kind of said, was that the church itself needs to sort of become more itself in a way, to organize, to be a little less democratic, right?
Yeah.
There we have like democracy sort of infiltrating the church at a variety of levels, where people get to sort of in effect vote for what kind of content they're going to hear. And then that leads to priests and pastors, and other churches do the same, just sort of talking in really vague general terms to avoid facing anybody's wrath. But then they've abdicated their role as actual moral leadership. Pure and simple. Nobody knows what they said. They go away. They don't have any idea. If you ask them right after they walked out of church, what did you just hear? They wouldn't be able to tell you, and it's not entirely their fault. So like, I don't know what my question is, except for like thoughts on the American church, like how it's organized, how it operates.
Well, I'll say this, in terms of what priests can practically do, or even ministers in general, well, priests in particular, when they're preaching, I think the best thing that you can do is like cite from the papal encyclicals, cite from the ordinary magisterium of the church, show that this is what has historically been taught, cite from the church fathers, right? Because I think what ends up happening is, if you're dealing with Catholics who are, they claim to be conservatives, but then they don't want to hear about things that sound socialist. But what you do when you cite an authority is you put them in an awkward position where they have to either choose now between being what they perceive as conservative or being Catholic, right? And then what hopefully will happen is they'll see that their Catholicism needs to be the superior in informing their conservatism, what it means to, be to having their political perspective. Because when you look at the authority of the popes and the authority of the fathers and what they do in a universal way teach on social matters, it's neither, let's say, libertarian, nor is it full-on communism. It's something almost transcendent of those categories, but still incredibly powerful for us today. So I think that if there was a willingness to kind of teach these things and cite from the authority of the church and put the two together and actually kind of illustrate the middle way that the church presents, I think people would be really attracted to that idea, that there is a middle way, that they don't have to go on either extreme, and that the church provides that with authority. The other thing I want to mention when you were talking about the dynamics between the parishioner and the priest is, I think we've lost this idea to some extent of the fatherhood, the good masculine traits of the priest, the bishop, and the pope. And what needs to happen, I think, is we need to see, and I mean, so one word that I don't think anybody is going to associate with the Francis papacy is masculine, right? Because generally speaking, I love Pope Francis to death, right? He is the Holy Father. I accept his authority as a successor of Peter, right? But I mean, there are times where you have to kind of see that Pope Francis has not dealt so well with certain issues. For example, I think his relationship with the Latin Mass community is incredibly strained. I don't think a lot of people really perceive Francis as someone who's preserving the tradition. And the default in secular culture is to view him as a kind of liberal pope. But then when in reality, you see that Pope Francis actually says things that are very conservative, right? Or when Pope Francis tries to use his kind of, let's say, his moral credit to kind of give a middle way position. And I could give examples, but I don't know if I want to do it here just yet. Whenever Pope Francis tries to give that middle way, nobody listens because we've already dubbed him a liberal pope, right? And so I think somehow the Pope needs to, in a very kind of direct way, in a very fatherly way, show that, okay, look, no, we have to accept the authority of the church. We have to accept the authority of the ecumenical councils, including Vatican II. We also have to accept the validity of the traditions of the church, including the Latin Mass. We need to have this Pope who is going to be very masculine with this middle way. And then what ends up happening, hopefully, is that the bishops will reflect that kind of masculine fatherly strength in giving the people a middle way, but with the authority of the church. Because I think, the things that you believe in terms of social and moral doctrine, they have the authority of the church behind them. And that's something that if a conservative is properly oriented, is going to listen and perk their ears up to, because they want to obey the tradition and the authority of the church. Well, guess what? The social and moral doctrines that you think are socialist are part of it. So I think that hopefully that top-down example would effectively, deal with some of the problems that we have. The idea of a good masculine fatherhood is missing from the priesthood.
I think I basically agree with you. I think I would say a lack of true leadership, right?
Yeah.
It's like just actually possessing the authority that they have. So yeah, I think that's, that's why I was attracted to the church to begin with. And it's been kind of disappointing when you don't see it. I think people crave that, right? They want to have some leadership. They want it also to be reasonable, not just like, because I said so. That's not masculine authority either, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's often what people kind of default to if they don't know why, because they haven't bothered to figure it out for themselves too. And I'm sure there are some priests that fall into that category.
Because the issue, when I was in the novitiate with the Dominicans, one of the elderly priests, he said to me, there's a point in every son's life where he has to forgive his father. And I think a lot of the kind of traditionalists who are angry at Pope Francis, or even the post-conciliar popes, they are kind of disgruntled sons who could never forgive their father. And at this point in the history of the church, these individuals, they no longer view the Pope as a father. Hence, the chair of Peter is empty. They feel like their father has abandoned them in a sense. And I think a lot of the people who are angry with Pope Francis, they don't view him as a father. They view him as a boss, somebody that they just have to deal with and tolerate and live under. And so that's why the image, I think, of a father is so important for not only being able to use that capital to assert with authority, right? But also being able to propose a middle way and work on dialogue with the people. That image of fatherhood is so important to get both nuances.
Yeah, one of the in Schindler's book about politics of the real, one of the prescient points he made, I think, is that in modernity we've lost authority, we just have power. And it's all tied up with that sovereignty that Willard Jones is talking about. We just have this arbitrary play of contesting claims of power instead of legitimate authority that at least theoretically could genuinely command obedience, fealty, what have you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, your point about like the arbitrariness of power, I think is really key because, at least with like the loss of a natural law framework, a lot of God's commands and authority were perceived as just under a voluntarist framework where God just commands, and that's the basis for our moral obligations and duties. But there is no, let's say, natural internal logic to it. There's nothing rooted in our nature and our flourishing. It's just God from on high has made the divine command. There are our obligations and duties. And so then at that point, that filtered into government and then made power just seem arbitrary because it's not rooted in any deeper sense of the good.
And there can be no genuine integration. It's just contesting wills that are opposed to each other.
Yeah, I mean, and the example that Willard Jones used of the hanging of those those criminals who made counterfeit money, and they were trying to figure out the various people were trying to figure out on whose gallows these criminals should be hanged. For us today, we'd be like, who cares? Just get the job done, right? Like they were guilty of the crime, okay, but then they actually thought that no, these little details matter and they can be scientifically, in a way, figured out and solved. So it wasn't just arbitrary. It wasn't just we wrote it on a piece of paper that this is the law, there's the law. It's like, no, we are actually coming to an investigation of the nature of justice and on whose gallows this person should be, punished.
Mhm. Well, and I think that framework between just the two opposed, unintegratable wills or parties, that leads into like one of our pet issues on this is talking about the environment. And we wanted to get your thoughts on like what Catholicism and your take has to say about the environment. And it seems to me that part of why it's so hard to talk about the environment is we basically see it in the same terms, that there's the environment and then there's us and our ability to convert its bounty into plastic and comforts.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that, or what do you think?
Well, in terms of the environment, I think the first thing I'd want to begin is just discussing the reaction of some conservative Catholics to the environment. So whenever you mention it, right, they roll their eyes, and it's not because they don't care about the environment, right? But it's because, one, when they hear their priest or bishop or pope talking about the environment and environmental issues, they see it as an attempt to be kind of popular with the progressive liberal agenda, to kind of show that they're in it and cool with it, right? Or this kind of, let's say, kind of worldwide, global kind of view of things, rather than actually something more concrete and practical, right? And so they view it as basically virtue signaling, and so they're people don't like hearing about it. But when you look at like at least other conservatives, what they've said about the environment, so even conservative philosophers or just conservative individuals, they're going to take let's take a conservative individual, like someone who lives on let's say a conservative who lives on a farm, right? He takes good care of his land. He cares about how things look. He cares about the flowers. He cares about if there's if some bureaucrats try to build on his land some ugly train station or some gas station or something like that. For conservatives, one way to appeal to them with the environment is maybe a kind of aesthetic argument, a kind of argument also of legacy, of being able to pass on something to your children that's beautiful and not kind of caught up in this kind of machinery of the world, right? Something that can be this plot of transcendent land, of an access to beauty and the legacy of the family. So my position on the environment is, well, one is that, I do like that conservative defense of the environment, where it's for the aesthetics and the sense of home in the world to some extent, and that sense of legacy. But also just in terms of like just hard, ethics, right? Like when you damage the environment, you're also damaging human life. You don't, so some people kind of get annoyed because they think environmentalism and veganism go together. And it's like, well, are you saying that then, I have to care about animals as much as I do humans or something like that? And I think the proper response is, well, one, I think that when you look at how the environment and even animals and the life and flourishing of animals ultimately affects human life as well, even if you have this anthropocentric view, you should be concerned about the environment, because it all is connected and gets us back to our shared existence on this planet. So the last thing I wanted to talk about was, you mentioned how some people see themselves as disconnected from the environment. And I think in large part it's because we politicized the environment so much. And people nowadays, they hate politics, or they're annoyed with it. They don't want it to become their religion. That when you bring up the environment to them in a political context, they don't want to hear it. But when you put them on a plot of beautiful land, and then you watch them care for it, you watch them care about the animals that live on it, you watch them walk through the fields with their children and look at the animals and care about, let's say, if their child sees a horse and loves that horse, then they want to take care of that horse. I think that the reason why we feel disconnected from the environment is because we politicized it to death, rather than actually have gone out and experienced it and felt any deeper connection with it to our own humanity.
Well, I totally agree with that as far as it goes, because, we definitely have politicized it. And I would say that their initial instinct to think that their priest is virtue signaling is probably correct, because he probably is, in the sense that, you know, most people, including our ministers, mainly talk, and we have a tendency in our society to equate talk with action, as though if you say a certain thing, you have now acted in its favor. But there has been no material change whatsoever. So I think that's not a bad, like, initial take when you hear people just sort of talk about it in kind of pious terms, right? But we are also separated from the environment because we live in such a structured, constructed, human-made environment, right? Like our whole economy encourages us to be removed from the environment. That's been the quest for, like, what, 150 years, is to become as like distanced from the environment, from our food sources, from, you know, knowing how it works as we humanly can, you know, like, it's part of, like, you know, we've specialized everything, we've outsourced everything. So only a very small number of people are those farmers, who even them are not really like dealing with the land. They're mainly in tractors or behind a desk, like looking at a computer. You know, we've automated so much, and most people get their food in little tiny plastic packages from the grocery store. We drive around in cars encased in plastic and metal. We air condition, we heat, we do this, we do that. So the human ideal has become, you know, separation from nature, and our economy thrives on that. So, you know, to sort of fight that impulse is made that much harder by the fact that our very, like, economic existence, most of our jobs are wrapped up in that distancing and ignorance of the environment. And then that's where the aesthetics come in. And from my perspective, is when you've lost, like, the visceral understanding that the environment can kill you, but also feeds you, and so on and so forth, then, you know, your best hope of connecting with it is to connect with the beauty of it, which is also true too, or the sublime. We have a class going to happen later on in the summer on the idea of the sublime, that can kind of remind you of the grandeur of nature and the power of it. And then that reminds people of God. I mean, it's part of the reason why people have such a hard time connecting with God too, is because God is very evident in nature, but we've done everything we can to enclose ourselves in a plastic bubble, right, to avoid it. So, I mean, this isn't really a question, but I wouldn't mind getting your reaction to that, right? That it's like the aesthetic route is second best. Our ancestors understood that it was something to be feared and something to be grateful for, because they literally understood their lives depended on it. But we've forgotten that.
Yeah, I would say that you know, when you talked about how nature can simultaneously feed and destroy, right? We even talked about this when we were reading Taylor, just how nature, at least with, like, let's say in our Darwinian kind of framework, right? Nature is now viewed as just this really hostile, brutish, cold reality, and it's something that we want to escape from. And we kind of, when we see within ourselves our kind of own organic, natural tendencies and so on and so forth, we want to somehow remove our own kind of brutish, cold elements, if you will, and evolve into something better, into something greater. And that's why, you know, people are so interested in digital immortality and other things, because I think there's almost a sense in which we are embarrassed of where we came from. And what we're trying to do is escape nature as much as possible and transcend it and become something rational and immaterial. You know, we want to escape our embodiment and be like the angels or something like that. And we think that that's the way to go forward. Yeah, I mean, it's a neo-Gnosticism. That's what it is. Yeah. So those are just some thoughts that I had there.
Thank you. Yeah, that's the opposite of incarnation, right? Like the the model that Christ gives us is God coming into the world and making it holy.
Yeah.
And here we are trying to escape it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we just view material things as things to be used and kind of just dismissed and dominated, right? Whereas with God, you know, his glory fills the earth. His glory brings ordinary things into the extraordinary, and the extraordinary becomes part of everyday life. Whereas with a lot of the ways in which technology is used and the kind of framework that comes with it, it's the desire to kind of escape the primitiveness of nature and evolve to something greater.
Mhm. Right. And I guess what keeps me up at night, I mean, here's just a little story that during part of my RCIA program, the bishop came and spoke to us, and somebody gave him a layup about, I don't remember what the question was, but he went on this deal about how, like, when he was a kid, there was an ambient cultural Christianity, and now now we're free to decide our own gender, so from the sexual revolution to transgenderism now, and everybody's nodding along, and like I'm trying to be a faithful Catholic, I agree, but I look over and we have plastic water bottles and like Hostess donuts or something like that, and I'm like, we literally have trans foods. It's not real food, it is subnatural food, and we all take that for granted. And it never occurs to us that, like, maybe to some extent so many kids are trans now because we've absorbed microplastics and hormones in our food and EMF from all of our devices, and it's more of that split between our culture and our ideas about things. Catholics, they want to talk about that, but they don't want to talk about the ways in we're complicit with industrial oil and degrading the environment, and how maybe actually it's connected to what we think we're fighting. How would you, part of me saying that, I feel like I'm being overly hysterical, but I'm pretty sure I'm not the crazy one in that room. But what do you think? And feel free to tell me I'm crazy.
Well, I think it's the first time that I've heard someone really make that connection. And so I don't want to dismiss it as crazy because I don't know enough to say anything really informed about it, or even enough to really dismiss it, right? But when you talk about, Catholics being complicit with the things that maybe, we preach against, something over here, but then we don't see how another thing that we're doing is connected to that. I mean, that's the whole conflict, right? I mean, that's what we're talking about before between, American Catholics, regardless of if they're liberal or conservative, trying to fit into the American political system, and then they don't see how they're in conflict or how they're compromising their Catholic faith to get acceptance, right? It never occurred to them that the two could be in conflict. Like the rich young ruler, he never saw any conflict between his wealth and his righteousness until Christ kind of brought the conflict out at that moment with him. So that's something we're thinking about.
Yeah, to me, it's even more direct. I agree with Spencer that there's a great likelihood that all that stuff that's now in our bodies does affect us in a lot of ways, probably as a main cause of cancer too. But just the fact that we live in such an artificial environment and that we actually look at a host, like a plastic encased, whatever the heck it is, hostess thing that's there, that is a completely unnatural thing that human beings, even probably maybe 100 years ago, let's be safe, would not even recognize as a food source, right? It would be absolutely bizarre. So, of course, living in that kind of environment where you can get anything you want and it usually isn't even recognizable as what it purports to be, makes one feel as though everything is fluid, right? Everything is a matter of construct. So they are totally related. One totally feeds into the other, and they both are products of the general liberal framework, way of thinking, that has led to this, to where we can't even recognize our own, what we put into our bodies. So why would we think the rest of our lives would be recognizable? You know, like the natural framework that you talked about earlier, it relies on people understanding what nature is.
Mhm.
You know, not just human nature, but nature, period, right? Having a connection with it. And we've totally lost that. So I think that there's something really, you know, for all of us to think about. Like you can't totally untether yourself from nature in one area of your life and expect it to adhere in another. Yeah, I don't know. We need to talk more about that. We only have so much time, but like that might be something to talk about more in a different conversation, you know?
Yeah, just really quick though, I think it's an interesting thing to think about where, you know, let's say a child is raised in an environment where they see nature more often than machines and, you know, artifacts, basically, in the philosophical sense. I feel like that child would have a greater awareness of what is given, what is objective, what is kind of almost beyond human control and construct. Whereas the child who's just raised where everything is constructed, where the nature, there isn't much of the given, only of what is constructed and manipulable, that would also have an impact, surely, on that child's view of the world. And so maybe that's the connection, or that's something worth considering and thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but I think that is one of the more salient trad critiques of the Novus Ordo, is that the part of what they're getting at with the reverence is that a lot of, and I don't know, I'm not an expert in this, but I've heard them say that part of it is, you know, by just handing the host to whoever wants to come up, and the loosening of discipline all over the place has taught people to be irreverent towards God. And then why wouldn't that flow towards other people? I don't know, just to connect it to earlier in the conversation. But
Yeah, also a good point. There's some good connections being made here. We did want to ask you, because we are a part of the Catholic worker movement at this point. We've, you know, Spencer and his girlfriend Emily are kind of heading up the John Paul II Catholic worker farm in Kansas City. And I definitely support them. And the Morin Academy is basically, that farm falls under the overall umbrella of the Morin Academy. It's part of our mission. And so, you know, we wanted to ask you what you thought of that, especially in light of the fact that Dorothy Day is in the process of canonization, and this could mean that more Catholics learn about her and the Catholic worker movement. Are you familiar with it? And just like any general thoughts on its place relative to Catholics and the Catholic Church?
Right. So with Dorothy Day, I know the basic outline of her life. And then in terms of the Catholic worker movement, I've heard here and there what it's about, but I don't think I've ever really like stepped in to the movement or experienced it or seen all the bits and pieces. So my knowledge is limited in that respect.
And
it's totally fine.
Yeah, and since you're familiar with her biography, what do you make of her, if you have anything to say about her?
Well, one thing I like about her personality is that she seems like the type of person who she's got this kind of roughness to her that's very appealing. I don't know how else to put it exactly, but you know, she said like, don't call me a saint, don't dismiss me that way. She was very open about her flaws, her limitations, about the pains in her life, about the sins that she had committed. But she sought something higher than herself. She sought to really make, let's say, human life better for others. And there was a concreteness about her, a realism to her, a grittiness to her that I really appreciate.
Yeah, and that's what's drawn us to her and Peter Morin, kind of the idea guy behind it, is that they are examples of Catholics trying to integrate all of their lives.
Yeah, Peter Morin was kind of on fire for Catholic social teaching.
Mm.
He's a French peasant who came, I think he went first to Canada, but then the United States. He was a laborer for a while, but he was brilliant, so he found his way to basically trying to teach the American working class about Catholic social teaching at a time when the fear of the church was that that I guess socialists would get there first, like the sort of atheist socialist movement would get there first. And so, I mean, part of Catholic social teaching is trying to address real needs from the perspective of the church, rather than waiting for some other organization to come in and guide the working class. So Mauryan was just on fire for it. And, he came, met Dorothy Day, they formed a team, and they started the whole idea of, Catholic worker houses of hospitality, of roundtable discussions where people of all kinds could learn and debate about Catholic social thought, as well as agronomic universities where people could learn how to actually grow their own food and take care of themselves and each other, and also learn from each other at the same time. So we've taken that general framework and thought about, how you implement that in the 21st century setting, but totally agree with you that both Day and Mauryan were very real, people. That grittiness that you notice comes from just having lived a really interesting but also very flawed life. But in conversion, in the case of Day, just then devoting her entire life to this cause, and particularly to the cause of the poor and the poor working class. So this is, and all across the world, there are these houses of hospitality now, and a growing number of farms as well. So that's our inspiration. I don't know. You're the guy on the farm, Spencer. You should.
I can't say it better than you did.
Uh-oh, we're in trouble. So anyway, we hope that we can represent it well over time, and we hope that you'll kind of keep track of us and what we're doing as we keep track of you and what you're doing too, because we do appreciate what you do.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say this. One of the things that I've noticed in my life is, I'm kind of, I'm moving and doing a lot of things, a lot of academic things and all that. One thing I really do care about is the pro-life movement. And I try to, with the channel, the money that I make, to give to a pro-life charity. But in terms of the social and moral teaching of the church, I'm sure that once I'm kind of, let's say, more settled down, right, and not just kind of always in the flux as a student and trying to go to grad school and then get a PhD and all that, that'll provide me time to really kind of also want to put myself, let's say, into a life of advocacy, right? Because I think, what you're talking about in terms of having communities and having these conversations and living together and living for the poor and making the social and moral doctrine of the church actually part of your daily life. That sounds very appealing. It sounds like something I want to do. And it's something that I think would help, resolve this kind of division that you sometimes feel as a religious person living in a secular world, because then your life and the moral teaching and social teaching of the church, they're just one and the same at that certain point in the worker movement. So that sounds like something I'd like to look into in the future. It reminds me, there's a conservative philosopher named Ryan T. Anderson. And he was kind of, he was educated at Princeton, well known for, the issue on Obergefell v. Hodges, defending the conservative position and all that. And if you keep up with him today, after the whole thing kind of, after, Obergefell v. Hodges was decided and he commented a little bit on the transgender debate, he's now settled down as a goat farmer. He's kind of gone out of that whole political crazy sphere. And, that honestly sounds like a very appealing direction to go in. So Spencer, the fact you're on a farm, I think is, it's a wise decision and a decision I'd like to make one day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would imagine when he's had some of the fancy dinners and all the glasses tinkling, and you find out how much good did it really do. Yeah, I totally get why you would settle down, tend your own garden. Yep. And then do what you can. Be grateful for what you've got.
Mm-hmm.
And it's plenty of work. So
Yeah, keeps him grounded. Haha.